So, last week we studied the breakup of week we studied the breakup of this small family of these three women, and that Orpah is convinced by her mother-in-law to return home to Naomi, or to Moab by Naomi. And we saw that instead of that, that Ruth pledged this solemn oath not only to Naomi, but also to her people and to her God. And we studied how that oath that Ruth made is a great pattern for us, that we should also be very dedicated to God, that we should go where he goes and live where he lives, and that we should look forward to being with him even after our life ends, and that we should be confident that we will not only be buried in our sins, but raised with Christ. And tonight we'll study how Naomi finally gets back home to Bethlehem, that we will finish chapter 1 and make it out of this chapter that we've spent about half of our study on, and move forward to more of the story that goes as a typical narrative, that we've been on these speeches a lot and spent a lot of time in introduction and other aspects, and we'll move a little bit quicker as we go through where we're just dealing with a big story that we're supposed to learn something from. But there's a famous book about this idea that Naomi is going back home, back from the 1940s, from Thomas Wolfe, called You Can't Go Home Again. And it's about these soldiers who are coming home after having been all over the world at war, and they realize that their lives are very different. It's about all the constant changes in our lives, the shifts, all of the things that go on. And the point of the novel is that your home is never the same. That when you come back, if you've been away for a little while, you realize, wait a minute, this is totally different. And sometimes we don't notice that when we live in the same place, that we don't see those changes. But if you think back about it, if you look at a map of something like Hickson, you'll see that our town has changed quite a bit over the last 5-10 years. And that if you go back further, you'll see that it's changed really drastically. And the other point that this novel is making is not only is the town changing, but you're changing too, right? That while you're away, you are becoming a different person than you were when you left your hometown. So you will never be the same as you were before, and your town is never going to be the same as it was before. So you can't go home again because you are different and your home is different. But Naomi's trying, right? She's been away for 10 years, and she's coming back to Bethlehem. And we will see that she also can't go home again. If somebody could read verse 19 for us.
So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, "Is this man?"
All right. So we don't know exactly how many women are greeting this pair, but they're really only interested here in Naomi. And we've got likely a very small village. There's some dispute about exactly where Bethlehem is at this point because we're talking about a really long time ago. But it's almost certainly this little area. If you can see this red arrow, there's a little dot right next to the star there. And it's kind of difficult to see because it's only 6 miles apart from Jerusalem. That you've got Bethlehem and Jerusalem really, really close in distance from one another. But remember that this is Jerusalem before it's the city of David. This is a great distance in time ahead of David doing his great expansion projects. It's still what was known as the city of Jebus, and it's a much smaller fort town. Now, this little picture here, this rendering, is one that's set about the Christmas time around when Jesus would have been there. And so we're talking about still a little bit larger town, but it gives you some idea of what people think the city of Bethlehem looked like around the time of Christ, about 1,000 years after the point when we're dealing with it. And you can see that it's a pretty small town. We are dealing with stone houses because in that area, almost anyone who could afford anything is going to be living in a stone house, not one made out of wood, and certainly not one made out of canvas if they could avoid it at all. But we're dealing with a pretty small group of people. But it's still the whole city, we are told. That everybody who lives in Bethlehem sees these two women coming down the road and they go, "Who's that? Let's go out here and see what's going on." Now that tells you what kind of town we're talking about, right? We sometimes talk about small towns, but we don't any of us live in small enough towns that everybody in the town is going to gather at the road and say, "Let's see who's coming in." I've been around some people that'll sit on their porch and they'll observe, "Hey, did you know whose truck that was? You know who those people are? What are they doing over there?" We know all those kind of people who want to be in other people's business. But in the city of Bethlehem, everybody wants to be in Naomi's business. She's coming down the road and everybody says, hang on, we got a visitor. Let's go see who it is. And everybody knows, not just your name in those kind of towns, but your whole life story, right? They could tell you anything you want to know, anything that has ever come out to be public, and a lot of things that are supposed to stay private. Everybody knows what's going on. And so they know who this woman is, it seems, and they're kind of audibly reacting to the presence of this woman. We're told that they're all kind of abuzz. There's a murmur in the crowd, and they're saying, is this Naomi? Look at that woman. Do you think that could be Naomi? What's going on with her? What kind of things do you think that they're noticing about her? Yeah, it's been 10 years. That's a long time for any of us.
No male escort.
Yeah. She left with 3 men. None of them are there. That would have been weird. She almost certainly was leaving with enough money to do okay in Moab, right? They went out there to go try to find food. But if you're going to go to a place like Moab, like we said, these are the enemies of the Israelite people. And so if you're going over there, you've got to have enough money for it to make sense. Because if you go over there begging, probably not going to go very well. You got to have enough wealth that when you show up, you can say, hey, I want some food. I want to buy some property. I want to get settled over here. So they probably left pretty well off. We've said that they are Ephrathites. That means some kind of wealth. So they probably were doing pretty well. Now here she comes back with none of the men and with a strange foreign woman that none of them have ever seen. She's probably on foot because we're going to be told that they are now desperately poor, the poorest of the poor. She's probably got old dirty clothes on. You imagine that kind of change? You imagine that kind of transition in a small town? That you leave some of the upper crust. You leave where you would have been influential in a town that size, right? If you got any kind of money and you're in that little town, people are going to know about you and they're going to go, oh yeah, they're doing pretty well. And then you come back kind of dragging. 10 years of hard living. Really difficult times. And Naomi hears these questions, which tells you they weren't being very secretive, right? They're not over there whispering where everybody's going, hey, come over here, I need to ask you something. They're getting kind of noisy about it and saying, is that Naomi? And so she responds with a bitter and painful speech. If somebody could read verses 20 and 21 for us.
He said to them, do not call me Naomi, call me Mara. The Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me? The Almighty has brought calamity upon me.
All right. It's kind of heartbreaking honesty, right? That's really tough. That you've been recognized by all these people who know who you are, and she gives this kind of speech as a response. And one of the first things she says is, hey, you know who you think I am. You want to call me Naomi, but that's not my name. You think that you know me, but that's not me. Because her name means pleasant, or my joy, or my delight. Wow, that's something really special from your parents, right? If you get that kind of name, they think pretty highly of you when you're born. If they say, you are my delight, they really are excited to have you. It's kind of the opposite of her sons that we pointed out. Her sons are named Sickness and Wasting. Kind of different from that, huh? You got a different opinion when you give those names. So her name stresses that she's a treasured gift to her parents. And in this whole story almost, she's a treasured gift to everybody around her. I suspect that she's a delight and a joy throughout almost her whole life. As we see throughout this story, we see her constantly being willing to think of others before herself. So she's always been living up to this name of Naomi. But she is changing her own name. The Bible has a lot of name changes, right? If you've read through the Bible, you could probably list at least a half a dozen. But if you're a really careful student of the Bible, there are over 20 name changes that go on from different people changing others' names. But this seems to be the only person that I can find who changes their own name in the whole Bible. That's kind of unusual. The closest might be Saul, right? He becomes Paul, but I don't think this counts. If you've studied this very closely, because a lot of people have been told Paul is given this name by Jesus or by himself when he becomes a Christian. That's not how that happens. If you read the book of Acts, what actually goes on here is that he changes his name when he becomes a missionary. When Paul is going out on the mission field, he says, I don't want to be called Saul anymore because that's a Jewish name. I want to be called Paul because it's a Roman name. So it's very much like if a man named John went down to Mexico as a missionary, he might call himself Juan. That isn't really him saying, I'm a different person. It isn't God directing him necessarily that way. He's just trying to fit in with the culture. So Saul to Paul is not really about Paul becoming a different person. It's about him wanting to fit in with the Gentiles that he's going to talk to. I think this is quite different than what we see with Naomi. So Naomi changes her own name. Why would she do that? It means something different, but why? What about her identity is different in her mind? Yeah. We have a lot of that where people are foolishly trying to do that today, right? They're saying, I'm not the person that you knew before, right? They're saying, I have a different gender, I have a different personality, I have a different this or that, and they say, you can't use my old name. That's my dead name. If you've ever talked to those people, they get very upset if you insist on calling them the name that you have always known them by. And the reason for that is they say, that's not who I am anymore. And that's what Naomi's saying. She's not doing this sinfully. She's not trying to switch her gender or trying to change her personality. She's saying, I'm not the pleasant lady anymore. That's not who I can be. I'm a totally different person. And so in a real sense, she's saying, you don't know me anymore. You think you do. You think that I'm this woman that you saw leave 10 years ago, but I'm a totally different lady now. And in a sense, she doesn't know them, right? Everything's changed about her, and a lot has changed in Bethlehem. As we said, she can't go home again. She's totally different. Bethlehem is totally different. So she wants to be called Mara, a name that means bitter. That's tough. Going from pleasant to bitter. She went away as a sweet delight, and she comes home a bitter woman. And this name that she is choosing, we can see in Scripture, is associated with horrible things happening. Whenever this word Mara happens in the Scripture, it means something awful has happened to someone, and sometimes it means that someone has died. And I think for this woman, she says Naomi has died. Only Mara is alive now. But this bitterness didn't happen by accident, did it? It wasn't just something that happened in her life. Who did she say is responsible for her struggles? God. That's kind of tough, huh? The Hebrew that she goes with is Shaddai. She says, the Almighty, the God who has all the power, is the one who has done this. And we're used to this name being a name that we would say, this is one of God's great names. That wonderful Michael Card song, El Shaddai, we think of it as praising God and saying, wow, look at what God is able to do. And Naomi looks at it and said, yeah, God is all powerful. God has all of the ability in the world. And he turned it on me. He looked at me and he decided what he was going to do. The Bible that the Apostle Paul used, the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, it goes with in this title, the sufficient one. It says, Naomi calls out to the sufficient one and says, God who is enough. And the Lord is enough, but he didn't give Naomi enough. That's tough. God has all the power, and he used it against this woman. Back in verse 6, we said, God had considered his people, and he gave them food. He considers Naomi, and he gives her emptiness. One translation of the end of verse 20 is, God has filled me with bitterness. See, think about that. She's been emptied out and then filled with bitterness. That's pretty horrible. It's something that none of us would want. Naomi once again sounds like Job. In Job 27:2, Job calls out to God and says, Shaddai has made my soul bitter. Almost the same kind of thing that Naomi is crying out to God. And she continues in verse 21 and says, I left full, but Yahweh brought me back empty. She isn't being disrespectful to God. She doesn't address God directly at all here. She's focused on his hand in her suffering. Have you ever tried to be thankful for yesterday's food? You ever try that one? I mean, it's great when you're full, right? It's fine to do that. At the Thanksgiving dinner table, we can say, God, thank you not only for this food, but for all the meals you provided in this whole year. But can you imagine if you were at the Thanksgiving dinner table and there's nothing? What if it had been a week? What if it had been close to a month? And you're sitting down and it's Thanksgiving and you got an empty table. And you got to say, thank you, God. I ate 3 weeks ago. That was wonderful. Pretty hard, right? It's difficult for us to be thankful for what we used to have. That's the position that Naomi's in. She's empty, and it's hard to be thankful for the family members that used to be alive, right? When they're dead. When we need them and they're gone, it's hard to look at God and say, thank you for what I once had. That's a real challenge. A woman in the ancient world needed a man. It wasn't optional, right? That feminist slogan, a woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle. Not true in the ancient world. You got to have a father, a husband, a son, somebody, because if you don't, you're almost like a fish out of water. You're in a desperate position. No one to provide, no one to protect, no one who can make the household what it should be. And that's where she is. She's suddenly vulnerable and sees no prospect of hope. She plans to live in poverty with Ruth and die in misery. That's a discouraging lesson, right? That's something none of us want to hear about. We love it when we hear God's going to provide for you richly. If you do what you're supposed to do, God's going to make it all okay immediately. But then we have a few stories like this. Or sometimes we can look around the church and we can see some of those stories, right? Where we can see those people are doing okay, those people aren't. An important thing to remember is that Bible characters were people. They felt mostly what we feel. They had plenty of different experiences and used different language, but they lived through almost all the same things that we deal with. They weren't people who had some kind of miraculous faith all the time. They had to make it through even when life got to this point. Even when you're empty and then filled with bitterness. Naomi is in a deep depression. She's struggling. The Bible knows plenty about anxiety and depression. Anxiety, fear, and worry are about the future. That's when we think about something and we wonder what's going to happen next. When you're anxious, you're concerned that the future may be different than you wished it was. But depression, or as the Bible frequently calls it, the pit, is when you lose hope for the future. That point when you no longer care what's coming in the future because you think it's going to be just like this. I'm so miserable, I know that this misery is never going to end. I'm stuck right here. David is a great example of this. He killed Goliath, He was anointed king and he served in the palace. He's having all kinds of wonderful blessings. And then he has to go on the run and hide for 15 years. Sometimes when you're reading through those stories, you think, oh, well, yeah, he's over here for a few days, and then he's over there for a few days, and then he's fine. No. 15 years of running and hiding, of misery, of not being where he's supposed to be. The prophet has anointed him and said, you're going to be king. But then he gets 15 years of running and fleeing for his life. So we can see David vacillate in this period between anxiety and depression. He'll sometimes worry about the future, and then he'll sometimes say, I don't have a future at all. I don't know if this is going to work out the way that God said it was. It just doesn't seem like it's ever going to come to fruition. We see in Psalm 13 at the beginning of it there, where he asks, God, will you forget me forever? He's not asking, God, have you forgotten me? He says, you forgot me, and is it going to be for all time? Are you ever going to look back at me and see who I am? Don't you remember the promise you made? Don't you understand that your prophet foretold what my future would be? And here I am in a place that it looks like that's never going to happen. When you're in that position, it's very hard to hold on to the promise, right? How long can you do that? If somebody's prophesied something over you, or even less, you just have a general promise from the Scripture, and you're in misery, and you're in depression, and you have anxiety, and then you have that for years, the promise starts to wear thin to you. It starts to be very hard for you to cling to that and say, this is what is going to be. That is a challenge for all of us. And of course, the famous psalm that Jesus quotes on the cross in Psalm 22, he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Those are first David's words before they are the words of Jesus. And that's wonderful to me that Jesus lifts those words back up. Because that tells me that God heard it when David said it. God heard it and cared enough about it to not only put it in his Bible, but to put it on the lips of his son. In the most difficult trial that anyone has ever gone through, he said, this is what I heard. I hear every one of those times. Every time you feel abandoned, every time you feel depressed, every time you wonder if your future is ever going to be what God said it's going to be, God has heard it. And he remembers it. He knows that it's there. Depression can feel like you're down in a deep, dark hole. When you're in that pit, it's such a challenge to see anything else, right? If you're in a deep enough hole, even if the top is open, you can't see anything. Because eventually, the light keeps getting cut off. And Naomi feels like God is siding against her. She's not just saying this stuff has happened. She's saying God did it. God caused all of this. The Hebrew in verse 21, as Chris's translation correctly said, is literally, God is testifying against me. This is the only time in the Bible that this verb of testimony against someone is used about God against a person. It's as if God is in the witness dock and he is standing there saying, Naomi deserves this. Man, what a picture. Can you imagine if God got up in the witness stand and testified against you? What's your lawyer going to say? How are you going to deal with it? We're told in 1 John, if we receive human testimony, the testimony of God is greater. Because everybody knows God doesn't lie, right? What are you going to say? How would you even start? There's nothing. All you can say is, he said it, it's got to be true. Now, this is formal legal language. So does this mean that Naomi did something wrong? What do you think?
I don't think so.
I think you're right. We
I
just,
think she's admitting her own failures, not his.
yeah. I don't think we even know if God is bringing a case against her. All we know is Naomi is saying he is. And that's the challenge for us, right? When we read a book like Ruth, when we read a book like Job, we come to the end and we don't get the revelation where God pulls back the curtain and says, hang on, let me explain everything that went on. That would be wonderful, right? If after some horrible trial in your life, God said, wait a second, I'm going to bring a word of prophecy and I'm going to explain why this happened and what you're going to get out of it. That'd be great. He doesn't do that. Almost ever. He usually allows you to go through these things and then expects you to figure out whatever you are supposed to figure that out through prayer and reading the scripture and the wisdom that he provides and an awful lot of wrestling. And that's the point. You got to wrestle through that. And that's tough. We don't like that part. We would rather have God say, this is what's going on here. But he doesn't. Some people get very focused on the reason for their circumstances, right? I hear a lot of people who will say, I need to know why this bad thing is happening in my life. Or even other people will say, I need to know why this bad thing is happening in someone else's life. And all of us, no matter how studied, no matter how wise, can't say. Because unless God reveals it directly to you, you won't know. Most of the time, you cannot explain it in a way that is concrete. You can give some ideas. You can say maybe this or maybe that. But you can't give someone any kind of pat answer. No accusation is made against Naomi throughout this book. It's easier to dismiss hurting people when we think that they deserve it, right? If somebody shows up to you and they say, hey, this horrible thing's happening in my life, and then you get that question of, well, what did you do to cause that? The reason they're asking that is to see whether they can shut the door in your face. They don't want to help you. And if you can say, I think I know what you did, then you don't have to help. I'm very thankful that God doesn't give us that information, because all of us would be really bad with it. If I knew what all of you had done, I wouldn't teach to you. And if you knew what I had done, you wouldn't want to listen. Because God keeps all of our hearts to himself. And he says, I'm going to do this thing in this way, and you're going to have to figure it out. The Lord wants us to focus on our pain. He wants us to look at Naomi and say, man, what must that have been like? To lose everything. And to try to come back home and have everyone say, what's happened, Naomi? You looked so different. How can you be so changed from what you were? Naomi doesn't question what God is doing or why, but she does complain. She lifts out a complaint. And she's complaining about God to a whole town. That's tough. She announces that God has treated her bitterly. Her family left full and she came back empty. Then she says God testified against her and brought calamity on her. She makes it very clear that God did this. And she tells the whole town. Can you imagine if somebody asked that on Sunday? Hey, Pastor, I got a word. Hang on. I need the microphone. I bet we wouldn't get very far before Pastor would say, whoa. Hang on. If you're going to tell me that God emptied you and is dealing bitterly with you, you're going to have to get to a point. Because we don't want to hear that. That's tough. It's not encouraging. It's the opposite, right? People would not have gone away from Naomi thinking, wow, what a testimony. I mean, can you imagine what God has done in that woman's life? That was just special. That really just touched my heart. Nobody would have thought that. But I still think it shows faith. So that gets us to our question of the week. How does complaining about God demonstrate faith in him?
acknowledging that he's real.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Sure. Yeah, I think that's great. Other answers?
Not an expectation he has on him.
Oh, there you go. What do you mean by that?
Well, if she's complaining, that means she felt like he let her down.
Okay.
His expectation.
Yeah, that she thinks God should have done something differently than that, and that tells us something about what she thinks of God. That she thinks he is going to be doing everything in her best interest in a way that's more obvious to her. Any other ideas?
I think it demonstrates more relationship. Like a lot of other religions, ancient and modern, like people want to either offer something to bargain and fix it themselves, or don't say anything at all and just say this is whatever, pick God's will. But she's having kind of a conversation
Yeah,
that expects that the other end listens and cares and can do something about it.
sure.
She's not having to offer something, fix it herself through a different perfect sacrifice or something like that.
So let me ask all of you, why didn't she do this on her own in her prayer closet? Why let the whole town know all this stuff? Why does God want us to see her doing this?
Because the future is going to be different.
Okay. Yeah. He wants us to remember what this was like. I think that's definitely part of it.
Or she still acknowledged him as Almighty.
Yeah.
I think is a big part of her acknowledging faith, even though the Almighty did all these things to her, is what she's saying, complaining about him, but she still says he is the Almighty.
That's right.
And so it's sort of like Job in his statement of, can I take all the good from God and not take the bad?
Yeah.
And I, he's still God. And, and so that acknowledgement, I think, is where the faith comes in, acknowledging him still as Almighty God.
Sure. And I think even a little bit of what Ashley was talking about of transparency, that this shows that this is a community, right? That's a kind of faith that we're uncomfortable with sometimes, that we're supposed to be bearing one another's burdens, right? Well, how do we bear a burden that we don't know about? Because if you only complain to God in your prayer closet, I don't have a clue. Unless God reveals that to me, I don't know. I don't recommend that you try to do that on Sunday morning, but I would recommend that you tell people when you have this kind of complaint, that you say, hey, I'm really struggling here. God has put me in a position that I don't understand. I need your help. We need to work through this. Now, Naomi doesn't ask for that, but I do think it's implied. I do think the idea is, if you care about me enough to remember me after 10 years, maybe you'll care enough about me to hear what I'm doing. Maybe even you'll do something about it. Naomi never attacks or insults God, though, right? Throughout this whole speech, she doesn't try to tear him down and rip up his reputation. If you follow the wife of Job, you curse God and die, right? That's what she said. You're in this horrible position, you need to curse God. You need to insult him, and you need to punish him for what he's done to you. That's not what Naomi does. She doesn't follow after that garbage. She says, this is what God's done. But she doesn't ever say that he's even unjust. There's not a moment where she says, God treated me unfairly. She says he did it bitterly, harshly, that he struck her. But this is just her understanding of reality. This is her saying, there's no one else who could have done this. As we said a couple of weeks ago, at the very least, God allowed it to happen. And so she sees it as from God's hand. She's crying out a true lament. Those are some of those scriptures that we talk about that are never over our bathroom wall, right? You don't ever have a whole lot of those verses from some of the Psalms of lament that people put in the entry to the church. They're tough. They're meant to be tough. She's frustrated, exasperated, and depressed. But the whole time she's saying, the Lord is God. He is the one who decides. Her complaint shows that she knows who's in charge of her life. She understands it at her core. She doesn't reject his control. She doesn't say, well, God, if you're going to do that, I'm just going to go find a Moabite God. You can forget it, because they could have provided for me better than this. She doesn't go try to find someone else. She doesn't say, well, if horrible things happen to people, there must be no God at all. She says, this stuff happened because the only powerful being who could have done it let it happen. She submits her life to God, even if she feels like it's turned out badly for her. It's a great example. Is your relationship strong enough with God to make it through something that you think He did badly to you? If you think He treated you harshly, are you willing to hold on to Him? Are you willing to acknowledge Him in that? She's willing to live a life of shame as long as it's with God and His people. She says, you know what? I may not be Naomi anymore. I may be Mara. But I'm going to be Mara right here. I'm not going to Moab. I'm not going to go live over there and be Mara in this other place. One of the things that we find uncomfortable is that she's empty right here. We want her to be filled right back up, right? When we hear about a story like that, when we hear somebody complaining and saying, man, I'm just really having it. This week has been awful. I have had nothing but terrible time after terrible time. We want to say to them, but just wait. Tomorrow's a new day. The mercies of the Lord are new every morning, and it's going to be just fine tomorrow. And what if it's not? What if you're going to have a tough time that keeps dragging on? When we're crushed and anxious and depressed, we want God to lift us right back up. We want Him to just say, okay, I see you there. You just prayed a prayer of repentance and you're going to get it fixed right now. But sometimes it's going to be a while. Sometimes you're going to try to get right back where you started. You're going to say, I need to go back where I started to get off the road. And then you find that you can't go home again, right? You find that you're different and that home is different. Life can leave you empty, hopeless, wondering how you're ever going to survive, much less thrive, right? Sometimes you're completely in God's will, and He leaves you out running away from your enemies for 15 years. That was God's will for him. He didn't do something wrong. It isn't like the children in the wilderness. He's doing what's right, and he has to run for 15 years. That's a challenge for us. We don't like that kind of example. We want to say, God brought him to the palace, and then he became king. And we skip over that period. We all want to skip over the hard times and say, God, you're going to make me a king or a queen in your kingdom. God says, you're right. But first, some times of emptiness, some times of bitterness, because I know what I'm doing. But we have a hint of hope in the next verse. If somebody could read verse 22 for us.
So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by her daughter-in-law Ruth, a young Moabite woman. They arrived in Bethlehem in late spring at the beginning of the barley harvest.
All right. So one of the first things that you notice here is that it's very interesting. What does the narrator call this woman? Yeah. What happened to Mara? She just said, I'm not Naomi, and threw her tantrum. And then the narrator says, oh, no, you're not. I don't care what you think. Your identity is who I made you to be. You don't just get to change your own name. If you look through the Bible, there is not a single person, as we pointed out, who changed their own name successfully. She tries, and God rejects it. Nope, you're Naomi. There's no record of anyone ever calling her Mara. Not in the whole book. Nobody says, hey, you remember what you wanted to be called? I'll stick with it. I'll affirm you in your new identity. Nope. Every single one of them says, hey, Naomi, good to see you. Glad to know that you're still a pleasant delight. Even while she's empty and bitter. God intends for her to be a pleasant delight again. God has declared her destiny. And sometimes we get into a pit so deep that we think God has withdrawn all of his blessings. Because Naomi needs her circumstances to change, but God's not going to fix them yet. She's in this desperate position. And when chaos has left you empty, it's easy to feel alone. It's easy to feel like nobody cares about you, even God. To feel like all hope is gone. Now, did you notice in this little short section that we've been reading that nobody, this town, nor Naomi, mentioned someone else? Who do they forget? Yeah. It's like she's not even there. There's a woman there. And here these people are saying, hey, Naomi, is that Naomi? What about Naomi? Here's Naomi over here. There's a woman here right beside her. And no one thinks to say, who's that lady? What's going on here? Who is this? And then Naomi says, I am totally empty. I got nothing. Imagine being Ruth right then. Be like, what? Nothing? I mean, I could understand you had 3 men, you had wealth, but nothing? I did just make a big vow. I did just promise to stay with you. I did just follow you all the way from Moab. I've been with you for 10 years. Nothing? Wow. It's easy for us to get insulted, right? If you've been faithful to somebody, if you've been loyal, and they don't acknowledge that in one of those hard times, it's easy for us to take that personally and say, you know what? I'm going back to Moab. Forget this. She just told me that this God I just pledged myself to dealt bitterly with her and emptied her out and took everything away, and that we're going to have it horribly, and nobody even acts like they like her here. So what am I doing? I'm going home. She doesn't do that. These women are all focused on Naomi's circumstances, stunned by what's happened to her. Nobody seems to act, right? Nobody responds and says to Naomi, hey, it's not so bad. You got the town here. We're all on your side. We're rooting for you. We're going to make sure everything's okay. She gives full vent to her desperation and anger. Everybody just looks at her, walks away. That's really challenging, right? No record of a single person grabbing a hold of her and saying, oh, it's so good to see you, honey. We'll make sure everything's okay. Nothing. Everybody hears her little bit of a complaint, and they just kind of melt away. Naomi gives all of this out, but nobody addresses the Moabite in the room, right? Right there beside her is Ruth, the faithful daughter. And she just listens to all this pain, listens to all the complaint, and she just says, all right, come on, Mom, let's go. We're heading on to your home. And plods right along beside her. She doesn't turn around. She doesn't criticize. She doesn't even seem to try to do the there business. She's known Naomi long enough that she knows when she's in this spot, you're better off just being quiet. Just be there. Naomi's help is right beside her. And she doesn't even see it, right? She doesn't even know that this woman is there as this source of help. Because when you're in the pit of depression, that's what we feel, right? You can't even see the help beside you. You're in a point where you can go, I got nothing. And your family's sitting there going, what? What are you talking about? I've been here the whole time. I'm on your side. But depression just corrodes that. It makes the things that are most important to you seem insignificant. Naomi feels empty and alone, but Ruth's going to be faithful. She understands this is what family's really made of. Sticking by somebody when they don't even acknowledge that you exist, when they don't understand how important it's really going to be. When you feel empty and alone, the Lord's going to be faithful too. He's right there, just like Ruth, right beside you in the midst of that depression. Even if you don't see him or acknowledge him, he's right there on your side. He's working all things together for the good, we're assured. Even when it seems like he's doing nothing but giving you bitterness, he's working for your good. That's a hard promise. It's hard to see it because we are so short-sighted. Even if you think he's testifying against you, he's building your mansion. Right while you think he is in the dock trying to make sure you are convicted, God's actually doing everything that needs to be done to make sure you arrive exactly where you should be, in his home. And these women are arriving at exactly the right time. It's one of many, many what you could see as coincidences in the book of Ruth. They show up just as the barley harvest is starting. This is when they need to be there. The food is really starting to pour in. We're not talking about the first fruits where you have just a tiny bit of food left over. We're not talking about some point later in the harvest where people are going to be much more miserly. All the crops are in full bloom. Everything is ready for them to show up. And here they come, walking into town when winter and the famine are over, and the barley harvest is here. And Bethlehem, this thing that has been the breadless house of bread, is going to have food. Here they are. But Naomi and Ruth are still empty for now. So, we'll try to get them some food next time. If we can make it into our study of chapter 2, as I said, we will pick it up a little bit and get through to the point where they have gotten something to eat. So, anybody have questions or comments? All right, well, our question of the week for next week is, what should you do if you're empty and everyone around you is full? Who will close us out in prayer?